a.m. Thursday morning, Russian missiles began to rain down across dozens of Ukrainian cities. It only takes a few minutes for Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky to declare martial law. But by then, Putin had already successfully taken out critical military infrastructures such as communications, airfields, planes, and runways. Half an hour after the missile strikes began, Russian ground units started moving in, successfully encircling the city of Konotop. This rapid series of events followed decades of rising tensions and marks the beginning of a new global geopolitical landscape. Welcome to Global Investing, a channel where I cover geopolitics and macroeconomics. In this video, I'm going to help you see through the fog of war, understand the core dynamics of the Russo Ukrainian war, and what happens next. To understand why this conflict has arisen and how it will play out, we need to know what is motivating Putin. There is much debate here, and we can never really know the answer. Only Putin knows the answer. Nonetheless, looking at the historical and geostrategic context gives many clues. Russia and Ukraine have a long cultural heritage dating back 1,000 years to Kievan Russian Empire building, war, revolution, and everything in between. In his essay on the historical unity of Russians and Ukrainians, Putin writes, "Our spiritual, human, and civilizational ties formed for centuries and have their origins in the same sources. They have been hardened by common trial, achievements, and victories. Our kinship has been transmitted from generation to generation. It is in the hearts and the memory of the people living in modern Russia and Ukraine, in the blood ties that unite millions of our families." Evidently, Putin's view on the Ukrainians' national identity is colored by their shared history. Putin has never recognized the independence and legitimacy of Ukraine, calling it a failed state. Could it be that he views it as just for Russia and Ukraine, formerly a great empire, to be reunited? That he sees this as a historical destiny of the Russian people, and that he has a role to play in this destiny? Putin goes on to write, "Just have a look at how Austria and Germany, the USA and Canada live next to each other. Close in ethnic composition, culture, in fact sharing one language. They remain sovereign states with their own interest, with their own foreign policy. But this does not prevent them from the closest integration or allied relations. They have very conditional, transparent borders, and when crossing them, the citizens feel at home. They create families, study, work, do business. Incidentally, so do millions of those born in Ukraine who now live in Russia. We see them as our own close people." How would we feel if a Russo-Chinese military alliance turned our allies against us? Many take this essay to be a show of Putin's true colors, that he's a true believer in this Russian mythos of a special role in history. This is but one of several speeches over decades where Putin has expressed such sentiments. If this is his motivation, he's running out of time for empire building. He's nearly 70 years old. For how long can he hold on to power with opponents fighting to seize it from his grasp? And the younger generation, who weren't alive during the Soviet era, may not buy into this narrative. Many notable public intellectuals argue fervently that this is what Putin is after. Consequently, they say, the only language Putin will understand is force, and that the West must unify in a decisive counterstrike. But can we really know that these are his motivations? If they aren't, then confronting Russia militarily will only lead to further conflict, with the existential nuclear threat looming ever closer. These speeches may simply be part of Putin's geopolitical chess game. It's also possible he believes, in his heart, that the Russian and Ukrainian peoples should be united, but in his mind knows warring over it is foolish. There are also those who argue that the primary motivation for invasion is Ukraine's geostrategic significance and the security threat it currently poses to Russia. Putin goes on to argue in his essay that, step by step, Ukraine was dragged into a dangerous geopolitical game aimed at turning Ukraine into a barrier between Europe and Russia, a springboard against Russia. There are two primary elements to the geostrategic security threat. One is the geographic position. The other, NATO membership. Distinct but related. Geographically, Ukraine is like a funnel on the European plain between Russia and the West. This plain stretches from Germany towards Russia, enclosed by the Baltic Sea to its north and Carpathian Mountains to its south. The military strategic meta for Russia has always been to push westward on the plain, decreasing the front, which must be defended, and creating a buffer between Moscow. At the fall of the Soviet Union, Russia lost control over the strategically significant portions of the plain. This is in part what Putin was referring to when he called the fall of the USSR the greatest geopolitical catastrophe in the 20th century. Furthermore, the Crimean Peninsula is the only base from which Putin can exert control over the Black Sea and the Mediterranean Sea, as well as trade. The strategic significance of this can barely be overstated. In 2014, there was a coup backed by the American intelligence agencies overthrowing the pro-Russia government in Ukraine. Subsequently, the Ukrainians blocked Crimea's main source of fresh water, the Dnieper River. As Crimea continues to dry out, Putin's control over the region diminishes. In March 2021, Zelensky formally announced his intention to retake Crimea, a decision most likely made in corroboration with the White House. Finally, is the discovery of very substantial oil reserves in Ukraine. The importance of this oil is how it allows Ukraine to build an economic bridge with the West. Having already licensed exploration rights to Western oil companies, this creates a clear path to economic integration, EU membership, and potentially NATO membership. The implication of NATO membership is that Russia is pushed into a corner where their military and economic power would be forever restricted. Noam Chomsky outlines this quite well.
The idea that Ukraine might join a Western military alliance would be quite unacceptable to any Russian leader. This goes back to 1990, when the Soviet Union collapsed. There was a question as to what would happen with NATO. Gorbachev agreed to allow Germany to be unified and to join NATO. It's a pretty remarkable concession, with a quid pro quo, that NATO would not expand 1 inch to the east. That was the phrase that was used.
So Russia has been provoked?
Well, what happened? NATO instantly moved to East Germany. Then Clinton came along, expanded NATO right to the borders of Russia. Now there are the new Ukrainian government, the government after the overthrow of the preceding one, the parliament voted, I think 300 to 8 or something like that, to move to join NATO.
Which you can understand why they would want to join NATO. You can see why Petro Poroshenko's government would probably see that it's protecting his country.
No, it's not protect. Crimea was taken away after the overthrow of the government, right? He's not protecting Ukraine, is threatening Ukraine with major war. Well, that's not protection. The point is, this is a serious strategic threat to Russia, which any Russian leader would have to react to. That's well understood.
After the Soviet collapse, NATO pursued an open-door policy where any country could apply to join. Since then, there have been 2 tranches of expansion. First in 1999, when Czech Republic and Poland joined, and then in 2004, when Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Slovakia, Slovenia, Croatia, Albania, Bulgaria, and Romania joined. All these countries joined NATO of their own accord, and in contrast to the Soviet Union, NATO has never invaded a member state and forced them to stay. Nonetheless, this expansion of NATO goes against the spirit of understanding at the fall of the USSR and can be seen as a potential threat to Russia. Why would a military alliance be expanding if there wasn't an enemy? The strategy with Ukraine has been similar to NATO's strategy elsewhere. Try to establish democracy in the country, and in doing so, pull Ukraine out of Russia's sphere of influence and towards NATO's. This has been the policy of the past 3 decades. Was it a wise policy? Was it a successful policy? The test of a policy lies not in its initial implementation, but in its ending consequences. Those consequences are unfolding at this very moment and will be detailed shortly. Ukraine has been a subject of diplomatic negotiation for years, but they escalated in April 2021 when Russia moved somewhere between 20 and 30,000 troops to the Ukrainian border, along with armored vehicles, missiles, and heavy weaponry. At the time, it was unclear why these troops were being moved to the border, and it triggered an international scare of invasion. Russia simply claimed they were doing a military exercise. This started a round of negotiations, which ended with the Brussels summit in January, where Putin made 3 core demands. 1. That NATO stops its expansion. 2. That NATO troops should be withdrawn from Eastern Europe. And 3. That the USA no longer protect its European allies. These demands were seen as far too extreme, and the discussions ultimately led nowhere. The outcome of even great diplomacy is rarely satisfaction by all parties, but rather maximally tolerable dissatisfaction by all parties. NATO, being unwilling to take the security concerns of Russia seriously, nor Putin's implicit threat of invasion, did not concede anything, thereby leaving room for no such agreement. Subsequently, the buildup of Russian troops on the Ukrainian border continued, amounting to an estimated 100 to 190,000 by February. Whether the ultimate invasion was primarily due to security concerns or empire building is not clear to me, but the two are not mutually exclusive, and it seems that the combination of these factors culminated in the decision. But these factors have been present for over a decade, so why did the invasion happen now rather than at any other time? I believe there are 3 main contributing factors here: the present weakness of the West, the energy and commodity crisis, and the suggestion of Ukrainian nuclear armament. The weakness of the Biden administration was demonstrated in their withdrawal from Afghanistan, which resulted in the Afghan army deserting immediately. The Taliban took over the country in a matter of weeks. The abandonment of $85 billion of military equipment and its seizing by the Taliban, and the capture of allied civilians. This is no indictment of the decision to withdraw, which had huge support and was long in the making, but rather the catastrophic process of withdrawal. The West, in general, is rife with disorder, distrust, and crumbling institutions, a topic for another video. The Biden administration is merely one example of its consequences, one of several that Putin could take advantage of. Tying into this is the current energy and commodity crisis, with some of the highest prices ever seen. Russia supplies Europe with 45% of their gas and 30% of oil. Without this oil and gas, people freeze in their homes and factories shut down. With Biden shutting down American oil and gas production and the unavailability of LNG and crude carriers, Europe is left with no alternative. No doubt, this relationship is mutually beneficial to Russia, but Europe needs the gas more than Russia needs the money. Besides, Russia also has pipelines to China and Japan who will be happy to buy it on sale. Furthermore, Russia is a significant producer of commodities such as wheat, metals, and fertilizer, all essential to the European economy, which is facing high commodity prices already. This gives Putin leverage and makes it harder for NATO to place effective sanctions on Russia. Finally, the straw that broke the camel's back, the suggestion by President Zelensky that Ukraine would acquire nuclear weapons. The proposal was met with little international resistance, thus Putin had to act immediately. Nuclear weapons in Ukraine would change the power dynamic in the region forever and be an existential threat to Russia. With the already existing factors in mind, Putin needed to act before it was too late. Zelensky thought floating this idea would protect Ukraine. In reality, it was asking to be invaded. Monday the 21st, Putin televises a speech recognizing the independence of the Ukrainian rebellious regions of Donetsk and Luhansk. Under the pretense of protecting these countries, in his words, against a genocidal and Nazi government, Putin moves Russian troops into the region. Tellingly, Putin not only recognized the areas currently held by the separatists, but also the broader region claimed in their respective constitutions. Tuesday, Germany responds by halting the Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline project. Wednesday, a pre-recorded speech by Putin was aired as the invasion begins. I want to show you a few excerpts from the speech.
Уважаемые граждане России, особую озабоченность и тревогу о тех фундаментальных угрозах, которые из года в год, имея в виду расширение блока НАТО на восток, приближение его военной инфраструктуры к российским границам. Откуда наплевательское, пренебрежительное отношение к нашим интересам и абсолютно законным требованиям? Преследуя свои цели, пренебрегают нашими интересами. Уже сейчас, по мере расширения НАТО на восток, ситуация для нашей страны с каждым годом становится все хуже и опаснее. Дальнейшее расширение инфраструктуры Североатлантического альянса и начавшееся военное освоение территории Украины для нас неприемлемо. Очевидные геополитические дивиденды. А для нашей страны это в итоге вопрос жизни и смерти, вопрос нашего исторического будущего как народа. И это не преувеличение, это так и есть. Это реальная угроза не просто нашим интересам, а самому существованию нашего государства, его суверенитету. И есть та самая красная черта, о которой неоднократно говорил. Они ее перешли. В этой связи и о положении в Донбассе. Мною принято решение о проведении специальной военной операции. При этом в наши планы не входит оккупация украинских территорий. Мы никому и ничего не собираемся навязывать силой. А это значит, что принятые решения будут выполнены, поставленные цели достигнуты, безопасность нашей Родины надежно гарантирована. Верю в вашу поддержку, в ту непобедимую силу, которую дает нам наша любовь к Отечеству.
Notably, the metadata from this video shows that it was recorded on the same day as the Monday speech, indicating the premeditated nature of the invasion. After missiles take out essential infrastructure, the invasion begins from 3 axes. In the north ground, units move in from Belarus and Russia. One part of the force focuses on moving towards Kiev and another towards Konotop. By 3:35, Konotop was encircled and put under siege. The city was able to repel Russian forces for a few hours before losing control. By 1600, Russian helicopter-borne forces had captured Antonov Airport just north of Kiev. However, the Ukrainians launched a counteroffensive, defeating the Russian landing force. By this time, the Russians had captured Chernobyl and other territories in the north. At the same time, a Russian offensive is being launched from Crimea, repeatedly capturing much southern land before encountering some resistance as they reach several cities. The southern offensive from Crimea also launches westward a seaborne attack on Snake Island in the Black Sea, which is captured by 2200. This gives Russia control over the surrounding waters, which contain substantial oil reserves. On the eastern axis, Putin consolidates control over the separatist regions of Donetsk and Luhansk, while striking further into the Donbas region. A little to the north, another force moves towards Kharkiv. During these strikes, 137 Ukrainian soldiers were killed and 316 wounded. Russian numbers are unknown. 17 civilians were confirmed killed. From these numbers, we can infer that these were small-scale battles and that Russian troops were not going after civilians. The EU and NATO respond immediately by freezing the foreign-held assets of major Russian banks, such as Sberbank and VTB. This immediately puts these banks in a precarious financial position, which could ripple through the economy. The markets respond violently when opening on Thursday, with the Moscow Exchange Index down 50% intraday and closing down 33%. On Friday, the bombing and fighting continues in the north, with Russian forces successfully being repelled from Kiev, with one platoon captured near Chernihiv. In the east, Putin is also unsuccessful, being defeated in Starobilsk and retreating. In the south, however, Russians reach the city of Kherson and capture Melitopol. The fighting continues on Saturday, but no major ground was taken or regained. The fighting intensifies somewhat in the north, Putin likely realizing a heavier offensive would be required to take Kiev. On Saturday, the Western Alliance announces Russian banks are to be removed from the SWIFT payment protocol and the sanctioning of the Russian central bank by freezing its $300 billion in dollar reserves. This will mean the total collapse of the Russian financial sector, subsequently sending the economy into a deep recession. Banks that cannot transact outside their countries and have assets frozen face substantial solvency risk. Realizing this, bank runs started in Russia. If the banks can't find a new way of transacting money, they will collapse and bring the entire economy down with them. You might say the Russian central bank could ameliorate this by loosening up access to money, but when their US dollar reserves are frozen, their currency has no ground to stand on. Subsequently, the Russian central bank has been forced to raise interest rates from 10 to 20% to prevent a further decline in the ruble, which opened down 30% on Monday. This further tightens liquidity domestically, increasing solvency risk. The share price of Russia's largest bank, Sberbank, is down 99.7%. On Monday, satellite imagery showed a 27-kilometer-long infantry convoy 3 rows deep. This is likely in the range of 100,000 soldiers, tanks, and armored vehicles. Tuesday, March 1st, we see Russian mechanized ground units by the central station in Kherson. In recent days, Russian progress has been increasingly slowed as their supply chain is in disorder and troops have reportedly low morale. The convoy, which was heading to capture Kiev, has run out of fuel and stopped dead in its tracks. In light of this, the Russians have increased the intensity of missile strikes, increasing civilian casualties. This doubling down only reaffirms how important controlling Ukraine is to Russia. Putin's ultimate goal of the invasion is geopolitical and military security. He can achieve this in 2 ways. A. Capture Ukraine and install a puppet government. Or B. Reach a diplomatic agreement with Ukraine and NATO. Neither of these solutions involves flattening the country. If he wanted to do so, it's clear that he could. The first thing Putin did on 3 a.m. Thursday morning was take out Ukrainian air defense, granting him immediate air superiority. Once you have air superiority, it's fairly easy to bomb the hell out of the enemy. He has the equipment and the men. Instead, what we see is that most infrastructure remains intact. Civilians still have electricity, internet, and running water. There have been no significant battles, only light skirmishes. Every time the Russian ground troops encounter resistance, they pull back. This is all part of an encircling maneuver. Step by step, Putin is encircling Ukrainian cities, their armies, and ultimately the entire country, while making sure to cause as little harm to civilians as possible, because he has no intention of being a so-called king of the ashes. Although the invasion has not gone too smoothly for Russia, so far they have a decisive advantage in men and firepower. If their resolve remains strong, it's only a matter of time before they successfully encircle strategic points, including Kiev, and push westward, forcing his most ardent remaining opponents to flee into NATO territory. Unless NATO enters the conflict. This is where Putin's true motivations come back into the picture. If NATO leaders believe Ukraine would be the first of many dominoes to fall on the road to re-establishing a Russian empire, they will move to intervene directly. This would radically escalate the conflict, leading us to a third world war, and perhaps even a civilization-ending nuclear war. The stakes have never been higher. This is the most dangerous conflict the world has seen since the Cuban Missile Crisis. Only that Ukraine poses a greater risk to Russia than Cuba did to the USA. For Putin and Russia, this is an existential conflict. The current danger of the situation is only amplified by the fact that Western media is making it look like Putin is losing. Being a strongman leader, the appearance of weakness risks internal power struggle leading to his deposition. Ultimately, this increasing the chances that he act aggressively for purposes of self-preservation. When you have 2 rival parties of approximate power, each believing they have the upper hand, then no settlement can be reached. Neither side wants war, but neither side wants to give up Ukraine. So who will blink first? I sincerely hope a compromise can be met. The fate of the world depends on it. What do you think will happen? What do you think Putin's intentions are, and how should the West respond? Leave a comment below. Like and subscribe for future videos. I hope you enjoyed and learned something from this video. Until next time.